The sound of high heels clicking across marble echoed through the pristine lobby of Metropolitan Trust Bank. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her purse strap over her shoulder, her other hand resting protectively on her 6-month pregnant belly. The platinum banking section gleamed ahead of her, all polished brass and mahogany, screaming old money and exclusivity. "Excuse me, miss, but the platinum banking section is for premium customers only," the security guard said, his voice carrying the practiced politeness of someone who delivered this line daily. Sarah paused, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm here to see the manager about my husband's business accounts. Richard Mitchell from TechFlow Dynamics." The guard's expression shifted immediately. "Oh, Mr. Mitchell. Of course. Right this way. Ma'am." As they walked toward the executive offices, Sarah's mind raced. 3 weeks ago, she discovered something that shattered her world. Richard, her CEO husband of 8 years, had been hiding money. Lots of money. While he'd been telling her they couldn't afford proper furniture for the baby's nursery, he'd been maintaining multiple business accounts she knew nothing about. The discovery happened by accident. She'd needed his laptop password to order groceries online when her phone died, and she'd stumbled across bank statements in his email, statements showing deposits and transfers that made her head spin. Her husband, who claimed they were living paycheck to paycheck on his 6-figure salary, had been lying to her for years. "Mrs. Mitchell." The security guard had stopped walking. "The manager's office is just through those doors. But are you sure you wouldn't prefer to wait for your husband?" Before Sarah could answer, the main entrance doors burst open with enough force to make several customers turn and stare. Richard Mitchell strode across the marble floor, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his jaw set in the expression Sarah had learned to fear. "Sarah," his voice carried across the lobby, sharp and commanding. "What the hell are you doing here?" Every eye in the bank turned toward them. Sarah felt her face burn with embarrassment and something else, anger. "I'm trying to understand why you told me we couldn't afford the baby's nursery furniture when you have 3 separate business accounts I've never heard of." Richard reached her in 3 quick strides, his presence immediately overwhelming. At 6'2", he towered over most people, and he used that height like a weapon. "You have no right to go through my private business affairs." "Your private business affairs." Sarah's voice rose despite her efforts to keep it low. "We're married, Richard. We're supposed to be partners." "Lower your voice," Richard hissed, glancing around at the growing audience. "You're embarrassing yourself." "I'm embarrassing myself." The words came out louder than she intended. "You've been lying to me for years about our finances, and I'm the one who's embarrassing. Don't tell me what to do." Richard's voice cracked like a whip through the marble lobby. "Richard, please. We're in public. Can we just—" "I said don't tell me what to do." It happened so fast that Sarah barely registered the movement. Richard's hand connected with her shoulder, pushing her backward with more force than necessary. Her pregnant body, already off balance, stumbled. She grabbed for the nearest pillar to steady herself, her heart racing not just from the near fall, but from the shock of what had just happened. Her husband had pushed her, in public, while she was pregnant. "Is there a problem here?" The voice that cut through the tension was deep, authoritative, and carried the kind of quiet power that made everyone in the lobby fall silent. Sarah looked up to see a man emerging from the executive offices, tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. James Wellington had been the manager of Metropolitan Trust Bank's Platinum Division for 15 years, and in all that time, he'd never seen anything quite like this. As his eyes met Sarah's, something flickered in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or confusion. She looked familiar in a way that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "There's no problem," Richard said quickly, his voice instantly shifting to the smooth, professional tone he used with clients. "Just a small domestic misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Sarah stared at her husband in disbelief. "You pushed me?" "I barely touched you," Richard shot back. "You're being dramatic, as usual." James Wellington stepped closer, his keen eyes taking in the scene, the pregnant woman still gripping the marble pillar, the red-faced man in the expensive suit, the crowd of onlookers pretending not to stare. In his 15 years of banking, he'd developed an instinct for reading people, and everything about this situation set off alarm bells. Perhaps we should continue this conversation in my office, James suggested, his tone making it clear this wasn't really a suggestion. All of us. Richard's confidence faltered slightly. He clearly hadn't expected the bank manager to get involved. That's not necessary. We were just leaving. Actually, Sarah said, finding her voice again, I came here for a reason. I'd like to speak with you about my husband's accounts. Sarah, Richard warned, his voice low and dangerous. No, Richard, I'm done pretending everything is fine when it's not. James watched this exchange with growing interest and concern. The pregnant woman, Sarah, he'd heard Richard call her, showed a strength that impressed him despite her obvious distress. And there was something about her, something he couldn't shake. Mrs. Mitchell, James said carefully, why don't we step into my office? I'm sure we can sort this out properly. As they walked toward the executive offices, James found himself studying Sarah's profile. The shape of her nose, the line of her jaw, the way she carried herself despite being visibly pregnant and clearly upset, it all triggered a memory he couldn't quite grasp. 3 hours later, Sarah sat in her car outside the bank, hands shaking as she replayed the manager's words. James Wellington had been professional, courteous, and surprisingly sympathetic. He'd explained that while he couldn't discuss specific account details without proper authorization, he could confirm that Richard maintained several business accounts with significant balances. But that wasn't what had her hands shaking. It was the way James had looked at her when she'd mentioned her maiden name during the paperwork, the way his face had gone pale when he'd asked, almost hesitantly, was your mother Elizabeth Wellington? By any chance? How could he possibly know her mother's name? Sarah thought about the question that had been forming in her mind for weeks, ever since she'd discovered Richard's financial deception. How do you handle the moment when you realize the person you married isn't who you thought they were? When you discover that the life you've been living is built on lies? As she started her car, Sarah made a decision. She was going to find out who James Wellington was and why her mother's name had made him look like he'd seen a ghost. Because something told her that this day, this terrible, confusing, life-changing day, was just the beginning. The rain that had been threatening all afternoon finally began to fall as Sarah drove home, each drop hitting her windshield like the tears she was fighting back. Her phone buzzed through the car's Bluetooth system, and Emma's name appeared on the dashboard display. Hey, Em, Sarah answered, trying to keep her voice steady. Sarah, honey, you sound upset. What happened? Emma Mitchell had always been able to read her older sister's moods, even through phone calls. Richard pushed me today, at the bank, in front of everyone. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. When Emma spoke again, her voice was sharp with anger. He what, Sarah? That's assault, especially when you're pregnant. Tell me you called the police. I didn't call the police. Sarah turned into her driveway, noting that Richard's car wasn't there yet. But something else happened. Something strange. What do you mean, strange? Sarah killed the engine and sat in the growing darkness of her garage. The bank manager, James Wellington. When I mentioned Mom's maiden name during the paperwork, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. I think he knew Mom. That's impossible, Emma said immediately. You know what Dad always told us. After Mom died, her family wanted nothing to do with us. They blamed him for taking her away from their money and their fancy lifestyle. Sarah had heard this story countless times growing up. Their father, David Mitchell, had been a middle-class insurance salesman who'd fallen in love with Elizabeth Wellington at a charity gala in Boston. According to him, Elizabeth's wealthy family had disowned her when she married beneath her station, and they'd refused to acknowledge her daughters after her death from cancer when Sarah was 12 and Emma was 9. But what if Dad was wrong? Sarah asked. What if there's more to the story? Meanwhile, 15 miles away in his corner office at Metropolitan Trust Bank, James Wellington was making a phone call that would change everything. Marcus, it's James. I need you to run a complete background check on someone. Yes, immediately. Marcus Rodriguez had been James's private investigator for over a decade, handling everything from corporate due diligence to personal security matters for the bank's highest-profile clients. What's the name? Marcus asked. Richard Mitchell, CEO of TechFlow Dynamics. But I'm more interested in his wife, Sarah, maiden name Sarah Catherine Wellington. Wellington, any relation to you? James stared at the photograph on his desk, a faded image of him and his sister Elizabeth at her wedding 25 years ago. Elizabeth had been radiant in her simple white dress, her hand clasped in that of a man James had never trusted. David Mitchell had seemed nice enough, but there was something about him that had always rubbed James the wrong way. Maybe it was the way he'd swept Elizabeth off her feet so quickly, or the way he'd seemed eager to move her far away from Boston and her family. Possibly, James said quietly. Send me everything you can find. Family history, financial records, medical records if you can get them legally. I need to know if this woman is who I think she is. After hanging up, James opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small wooden box he hadn't opened in years. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a piece of jewelry, a delicate gold locket with the Wellington family crest engraved on the front. He'd bought it for Elizabeth's daughter, whoever she might be, years ago. A gift for a niece he'd thought he'd never meet. Back in her kitchen, Sarah was having a similar conversation with Emma, who had driven over as soon as she'd heard about the incident at the bank. You never talk about Mom's family, Emma said, setting down 2 cups of tea. Maybe it's time you did some digging. You know why I don't talk about them, Sarah replied. After Mom died when we were kids, Dad said her family wanted nothing to do with us. He said they blamed him for taking her away from their money. But what if he was lying? The question hung in the air between them. Emma had always been the more suspicious of the 2 sisters, the one who questioned authority and dug deeper when things didn't add up. Sarah had always been the peacekeeper, the one who accepted what she was told and tried to make the best of it. Why would Dad lie about something like that? Sarah asked. Maybe because he was ashamed, Emma suggested. Think about it, Sarah. Mom came from money, right? Real money. What if her family tried to help after she died, and Dad was too proud to accept it? What if he told them to stay away because he couldn't handle being seen as a charity case? Sarah considered this. Their father had always been prideful, sometimes to a fault. He'd worked 2 jobs to keep them in a decent neighborhood after their mother died, refusing help from anyone. She'd always admired his independence, but maybe there had been a darker side to it. There's only one way to find out, Emma said. You need to go back to that bank and talk to James Wellington. If he knew Mom, he might have answers. That evening, as Sarah prepared for what she thought would be a quiet night alone, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Mrs. Mitchell, this is James Wellington from Metropolitan Trust Bank. I believe we need to talk. Sarah's heart began to race. About my husband's accounts, I'm not sure what more there is to discuss. Not about your husband's accounts, James said carefully. About yours. Mine, I don't have any accounts at your bank. Mrs. Mitchell, would you be available to meet tomorrow morning? There are some family matters we need to discuss. Matters concerning your mother. Sarah gripped the phone tighter. My mother's been dead for over 20 years. What could you possibly know about family matters? Your mother was Elizabeth Wellington, wasn't she? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. How did you know that? Who are you? I'm someone who's been looking for you for a very long time, James said gently. Please, Mrs. Mitchell, give me 1 hour tomorrow morning. I promise you'll want to hear what I have to say. After hanging up, Sarah sat in her empty house. Richard still not home from wherever he'd gone after the bank incident. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to really think about her mother. Elizabeth Wellington Mitchell had been beautiful, kind, and impossibly smart. She'd spoken 3 languages, played piano like a concert performer, and had a way of making everyone around her feel special. But she'd also been secretive about her past. Sarah remembered asking about grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and always getting vague answers. My family's complicated, sweetheart, Elizabeth would say. Sometimes it's better to focus on the family we choose rather than the family we're born into. Now, sitting in the darkness of her kitchen, Sarah wondered if her mother had been protecting her daughters from something or someone. As if on cue, Richard's car pulled into the driveway. Sarah heard his footsteps on the front porch, heard his key in the lock, and braced herself for the confrontation she knew was coming. We need to talk, Richard said as soon as he walked through the door. Yes, Sarah agreed. We do. Richard's voice echoed through the house as he made his way to the kitchen where Sarah waited. She could tell by his footsteps, heavy, deliberate, angry that the conversation they were about to have would not go well. "You embarrassed me today," Richard said without preamble, loosening his tie as he entered the kitchen. "Do you have any idea what you've done to my reputation?" "Your reputation," Sarah kept her voice level. "You pushed your pregnant wife in a public place, and you're worried about your reputation. I barely touched you. You're being dramatic, as usual." Richard opened the refrigerator and pulled out a beer, popping it open with more force than necessary. "But that's not what this is about. This is about you going behind my back, trying to access my business accounts." "Our accounts? Richard, we're married." "No, Sarah. They're my accounts for my business. You have no legal right to them, and you certainly have no right to embarrass me in front of my banker." Sarah watched her husband drink his beer, noting the way his jaw clenched when he was angry, the way his eyes never quite met hers when he was lying. 8 years of marriage had taught her to read these signs, but she'd spent most of those years making excuses for them. "Richard, I found the bank statements on your laptop. I know about the accounts. I know we're not struggling financially like you've been telling me." Richard set down his beer with enough force to make Sarah flinch. "You went through my private computer. I was trying to order groceries when my phone died. I needed the password for the grocery app, and I saw your email was open. The bank statements were right there. So you decided to snoop. I decided to try to understand why my husband has been lying to me about our financial situation while I've been clipping coupons and shopping at thrift stores for baby clothes." And the silence stretched between them, heavy with 8 years of accumulated resentment and deception. Sarah had always known that Richard was controlling about money, but she'd attributed it to his business background. Successful CEOs were careful with finances, she told herself. They planned ahead, managed resources wisely. Now she was beginning to understand that what she'd interpreted as financial responsibility was actually financial abuse. "You don't understand business, Sarah," Richard said finally. "Those accounts are for complex transactions, cash flow management, things that would be too complicated for you to understand. Try me." "What? Try me? Explain it to me." "I have a degree in mathematics. Richard, I think I can handle understanding where our money goes." Richard's expression shifted, and for a moment, Sarah saw something in his eyes that made her stomach clench with fear. "You need to drop this. Sarah, you need to apologize for today, and you need to promise me you'll never go near that bank again. Or what? Or there will be consequences." The threat hung in the air between them like poison. Sarah felt her baby kick, as if responding to her increased heart rate, and she placed her hand protectively over her belly. "Are you threatening me, Richard? I'm protecting our family. Someone needs to." Before Sarah could respond, her phone rang. The caller ID showed the same unfamiliar number from earlier in the evening. "Don't answer that," Richard commanded, but Sarah was already swiping to accept the call. "Hello, Mrs. Mitchell. This is James Wellington. I apologize for calling so late, but I've been doing some research since our conversation earlier, and I believe the situation is more urgent than I initially thought." "What kind of situation?" Sarah asked, aware of Richard standing just a few feet away, his entire body tense with anger. "I'd prefer not to discuss it over the phone. Could we meet first thing tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock? "I don't think that's a good idea," Sarah said, glancing at Richard's face, which had turned an alarming shade of red. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand your hesitation, but I have information about your mother's family that I believe you need to hear. Information about your inheritance." "My what?" "Your inheritance. Mrs. Mitchell, I believe you may be entitled to a substantial family estate that you've never been told about." Sarah's legs suddenly felt weak. She sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her free hand still resting on her pregnant belly. "That's impossible. My mother's family disowned her when she married my father." "Mrs. Mitchell, with all due respect, I believe you've been given inaccurate information about your family history. Your mother was my sister, and we've been looking for you for over 20 years. The phone slipped from Sarah's hand and clattered onto the kitchen table. Richard moved quickly, grabbing the device before Sarah could react. "This is Richard Mitchell," he said into the phone, his voice crisp and professional. "My wife is pregnant and emotional, and she's not in a position to make rational decisions right now. I'd appreciate it if you'd stop harassing her with whatever scheme you're running." Mr. Mitchell, James's voice came through clearly, even from several feet away. I can assure you this is not a scheme. I'm a licensed banker and a member of the Wellington family. Your wife is my niece. That's impossible, Richard said, but Sarah could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. Mr. Mitchell, I have documentation, family photographs, and legal proof of kinship. I also have some concerns about your wife's financial situation that we need to discuss. Richard ended the call and turned to face Sarah, who was staring at him with a mixture of shock and growing understanding. He's lying, Richard said. It's obviously some kind of scam. Probably someone who heard about my business success and thinks they can con money out of us. But Sarah was remembering things. The way her mother used to get a faraway look in her eyes when she talked about Boston. The expensive jewelry that had mysteriously disappeared after her mother's death, jewelry that her father claimed had been lost. The way her mother had seemed to know things about art, music, and culture that didn't fit with the middle-class life they'd lived. What if he's not lying? Sarah asked quietly. Sarah, use your head. If your mother really came from some wealthy family, don't you think we would have known? Don't you think they would have contacted us after she died? Maybe they tried, Sarah said, the pieces beginning to fall into place. Maybe Dad didn't tell us. Your father wouldn't have kept something like that from you. Wouldn't he? Sarah stood up, facing her husband across the kitchen. The same way you wouldn't keep financial information from me? Richard's face flushed with anger. That's completely different. Is it you've been lying to me about money for years? Richard, you've been making me believe we're struggling while you hide thousands of dollars in accounts I don't even know about. Why should I trust your judgment about what my father might have hidden from me? Because I'm your husband, Richard shouted. Because I'm the father of your child. Because everything I do is to protect our family. By lying to me, by managing things you don't need to worry about. Sarah stared at her husband, really looked at him, and for the first time in 8 years, she saw him clearly. The control, the manipulation, the way he made her feel stupid and small whenever she questioned anything. This was her life. This was what she'd accepted as normal. I'm calling him back, she said. No, you're not. Yes, I am. And I'm meeting with him tomorrow morning. Sarah, if you make that call, if you go to that meeting, there will be consequences. I mean it. Sarah picked up her phone and looked at her husband. Richard, I don't think you understand. I don't care about your consequences anymore. As she scrolled through her recent calls to find James Wellington's number, Sarah realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of her husband's anger. She was too curious about the truth to let fear stop her. And that realization was more liberating than anything she'd felt in a very long time. The next morning, Sarah sat across from James Wellington in his mahogany-paneled office, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. The early morning light streamed through tall windows, casting everything in a golden glow that made the whole situation feel surreal. You look exactly like her, James said softly, studying Sarah's face with the intensity of someone memorizing a precious photograph. Like who? Like your mother? Elizabeth? My sister? Sarah's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. Your sister. But that's impossible. My mother's family disowned her when she married my father. James Wellington was a distinguished man in his early 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. But he wasn't smiling now. His expression was one of deep sadness, mixed with something that might have been regret. That's what your father told you, James asked gently. Sarah, we searched for Elizabeth for years after she disappeared. We hired private investigators, offered rewards, contacted every Elizabeth Mitchell in the country. We thought she was dead. She did die. Cancer. When I was 12. I know, we found out 3 years too late. James opened a desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. We finally tracked down the death certificate in 2010. By then, you and your sister had both moved away from your father's house. We had no way to find you. Sarah felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Everything she'd been told about her mother's family, everything she'd believed about why they'd lived such a modest life, might have been a lie. Why would my father tell us that you'd disowned her? She asked. I honestly don't know, James said. Elizabeth left Boston very suddenly after she married your father. She didn't return phone calls, didn't respond to letters. We assumed David had convinced her to cut ties with us. Maybe he thought you disapproved of him. We did. Initially, James admitted. David seemed like a nice enough man, but Elizabeth was set to inherit a substantial portion of the Wellington estate. We were concerned that he might be marrying her for financial reasons. And were you right? James was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. What I do know is that Elizabeth was entitled to a trust fund worth approximately $250 million. When she died, that inheritance should have transferred to her children. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'm sorry, did you say $250 million? That was in 2003. With compound interest and investment growth, your inheritance is now worth approximately $2.7 trillion. Trillion? Sarah's voice came out as a whisper. That's not possible. The Wellington family has been involved in shipping, real estate, and technology investments for 4 generations, James explained patiently. We were early investors in several companies that became very successful. Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon. Your great-grandfather had a talent for recognizing promising technologies. Sarah stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the city skyline. This had to be some kind of mistake or elaborate hoax. People like her didn't inherit trillions of dollars. People like her clipped coupons and worried about whether they could afford new baby furniture. I need proof, she said without turning around. I need to see documentation. Of course. James opened another folder and spread several documents across his desk. Birth certificates, family tree, genetic testing if you'd like it, photographs dating back to your mother's childhood. Sarah turned and walked back to the desk, studying the papers. There was her mother's birth certificate, Elizabeth Catherine Wellington, born in Boston, Massachusetts. A family tree showing the Wellington lineage dating back to the 1800s, and photographs, dozens of them, showing a young woman who looked exactly like Sarah at family gatherings, charity events, and formal dinners. This is really her, Sarah whispered, picking up a photo of Elizabeth at what appeared to be a college graduation. She looks so happy. She was brilliant, James said proudly. Graduated summa cum laude from Harvard with degrees in mathematics and computer science. She designed algorithms that we still use in our investment strategies today. Mom studied computer science? Sarah looked up in surprise. I never knew that. She never mentioned it. There's a lot your father apparently never told you about your mother's life before she married him. Sarah sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. Her mother hadn't been just a housewife who died young. She'd been a brilliant mathematician and computer scientist from one of America's wealthiest families. James, she said slowly, if this is all true, if I really am entitled to this inheritance, there's something you need to know about my husband. What about him? Yesterday, when I came to the bank to ask about his accounts, he pushed me in front of everyone. And last night, when you called, he threatened me. James's expression darkened. What kind of threats? He said there would be consequences if I met with you today. Sarah, I need to tell you something else. After our conversation yesterday, I had my investigators look into your husband's background. Richard Mitchell has been systematically accessing and draining a monthly allowance from your trust fund. What do you mean? When you married Richard, he gained access to a spousal allowance from your inheritance. $50,000 per month for the past 8 years. Sarah felt sick. $50,000 per month. Your husband has been receiving and hiding nearly $5 million from your family's money while telling you that you couldn't afford baby furniture. The room spun around Sarah as the full scope of Richard's deception became clear. He hadn't just been hiding his business income from her. He'd been hiding her own inheritance. Money that was rightfully hers. Money that could have made their lives completely different. He told me we were living paycheck to paycheck, she said numbly. Sarah, your husband is a financial predator, and I'm afraid he's not working alone. What do you mean? James hesitated before opening another folder. Our investigation revealed that Richard has done this before. Twice. He targets women from wealthy families, marries them, gains access to their assets, and then isolates them from their families. Other wives, Sarah's hand instinctively went to her pregnant belly. What happened to them? His first wife, Margaret Thornton, committed suicide after he drained her trust fund. The second wife, Patricia Carlisle, disappeared entirely. Her family believes she's dead, but her body was never found. Sarah felt like she couldn't breathe. The man she'd married, the father of her unborn child, was potentially a murderer, and she was carrying his baby. Sarah, I think you're in more danger than we initially realized, James said gently, especially now that you know the truth about your inheritance. The baby, Sarah whispered. He's been pushing for the baby to have his last name, to be listed as the primary parent on all the birth documents. If something happened to you during or after childbirth, and Richard had primary custody of your child, he would have access to your entire inheritance as the baby's guardian. The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. Richard wasn't just stealing from her current trust fund. He was positioning himself to inherit everything if she died, and given what had happened to his previous wives, her death might not be accidental. I need to get out of there, Sarah said, standing up again. I need to leave him. Not yet, James said firmly. If you disappear suddenly, Richard will know that you've learned the truth. We need to be strategic about this. We need to protect you and the baby. Then what do we do? First, we're going to transfer your inheritance into accounts that only you can access. Then we're going to gather evidence of Richard's fraud and abuse. And then we're going to make sure he never hurts anyone ever again. Sarah looked at her uncle, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. For the first time since she'd discovered Richard's deception, she felt like she wasn't facing this alone. How do we start? She asked. James smiled, and Sarah could see her mother's warmth in his expression. We start by getting you somewhere safe, and then we introduce you to the rest of your family. That afternoon, Sarah returned home to find Richard waiting in the living room with a stack of legal documents spread across their coffee table. He was dressed in his most expensive suit, the one he wore to important board meetings, and his expression was carefully controlled in the way that always made Sarah nervous. Hello, sweetheart, he said without looking up from the papers. We need to have a conversation. Sarah set down her purse and car keys, noting that Richard had positioned himself between her and the front door. It was a subtle intimidation tactic, but one she now recognized for what it was. What are those? She asked, gesturing to the documents. Papers that will simplify our lives, Richard said, finally looking up at her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Financial power of attorney, updated will, and custody arrangements for the baby. Sarah's blood ran cold. These were exactly the kinds of documents James had warned her about. Richard, we haven't even discussed these things. The baby isn't due for 3 months. We're discussing them now. Richard stood and moved toward her, still maintaining his position between Sarah and the exit. Since you're clearly not capable of handling our finances responsibly, as evidenced by your little scene at the bank yesterday, I'll be taking over completely. I'm not signing anything, Sarah said, backing toward the kitchen. Richard's carefully controlled expression slipped slightly. Yes, you are. No, Richard, I'm not. Sarah, you seem to be forgetting some important facts. Richard followed her into the kitchen, his voice taking on the patronizing tone she'd grown to hate. You're 7 months pregnant with my child. You have no job, no income of your own, and no family to support you. You need me. The lies rolled off his tongue so smoothly that Sarah almost believed them for a moment. 3 hours ago, she might have, but now she knew better. Actually, Richard, I do have family, and they have resources you can't even imagine. Richard's confident expression faltered for the first time. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the Wellington family. Ever heard of them? The color drained from Richard's face so quickly that Sarah thought he might faint. That's impossible. You told me your mother's family disowned her. I was wrong, and so were you when you thought you could steal from them. Richard's mask of control completely slipped away, revealing the angry, desperate man underneath. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? I know about the $50,000 per month you've been stealing from my trust fund. I know about Margaret Thornton and Patricia Carlisle. I know about your pattern of marrying women for their money and then destroying their lives. Richard's face went from pale to red in an instant. Who told you that? My Uncle James. You know, the bank manager you thought you could intimidate yesterday. Your Uncle Richard's voice cracked slightly. Sarah, whatever they told you, it's lies. They're trying to turn you against me. The way you turned me against my own family by lying about them for 8 years. Richard grabbed the stack of legal documents from the coffee table and stormed toward the front door. This isn't over. Sarah, you have no idea what you're dealing with. Yes, it is over. And yes, I do know what I'm dealing with. I'm dealing with a man who married me for money he thought I didn't know I had. Richard paused at the front door, his hand on the handle. You think you're so smart now, don't you? You think your fancy rich family is going to swoop in and save you. I think I'm finally seeing clearly for the first time in 8 years. Well, let me give you some clarity. Sweetheart. Richard's voice dropped to a whisper that made Sarah's skin crawl. You're carrying my child. That gives me certain rights. Legal rights. And if you think you can just walk away from me because you've discovered some family money, you're going to be very disappointed. Get out, Richard. This is my house too. Get out before I call the police. Richard stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that terrified her. It was the look of a man who was cornered and desperate. A man who had nothing left to lose. You'll regret this, Sarah. I promise you that. After Richard left, Sarah called James immediately. He knows, she said as soon as he answered. He knows I talked to you, and he knows about the inheritance. James, I think he's dangerous. Where are you now? At home, but I don't think I should stay here. You're right. Pack a bag with essentials for a few days. I'm sending a car to pick you up. Where will I go? To the family estate. It's time you met the rest of the Wellingtons. 20 minutes later, as Sarah hastily packed clothes and toiletries, she heard a car pull into the driveway. But it wasn't the car James had sent. It was Richard's BMW, and he wasn't alone. Through the bedroom window, Sarah could see two other men getting out of the passenger side. Large men in expensive suits who looked like they could be bodyguards or worse. Her phone rang. It was James. Sarah, the car I sent should be there any minute. Richard's here, Sarah whispered, moving away from the window. He brought two other men with him. I think they're trying to force me to sign those papers. Get to the bathroom and lock the door. Don't come out until you hear the police sirens. You called the police. As soon as you told me he'd threatened you, they should be there within minutes. Sarah could hear the front door opening downstairs, followed by heavy footsteps and Richard's voice calling her name. She grabbed her hastily packed bag and ran for the master bathroom, locking the door just as she heard footsteps on the stairs. Sarah, Richard's voice echoed through the house. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We just need to have a simple conversation. Sarah huddled in the bathroom, her hand protectively over her pregnant belly, and thought about how different her life had become in just 24 hours. Yesterday, she'd been a lonely pregnant woman married to a controlling man she thought she loved. Today, she was an heiress running from a husband who might be planning to kill her. The sirens started wailing in the distance, growing louder by the second. Through the bathroom door, Sarah could hear angry voices downstairs, followed by the sound of the front door slamming. By the time the police broke down the bathroom door to make sure she was safe, Richard and his companions were gone. But they'd left behind something that made Sarah's blood run cold. On her bed, next to her open suitcase, were the legal documents Richard had tried to get her to sign, except now they'd been filled out and forged with her signature. Mrs. Mitchell, Detective Rodriguez said gently, we found evidence of financial fraud, identity theft, and a pattern of domestic abuse spanning 3 marriages. Your uncle provided us with extensive documentation. What happens now? Sarah asked. Now we make sure your husband never gets the chance to hurt you or anyone else ever again. As the police cars drove away with evidence bags full of forged documents and Richard's financial records, Sarah realized that she was finally free. Free from lies, free from manipulation, and free from fear. But most importantly, she was free to discover who she really was underneath all the years of being told she was powerless. And that discovery was just beginning. The Wellington family estate stretched across 200 acres of pristine Hudson Valley countryside, its Georgian mansion rising from manicured gardens like something from a fairy tale. As the car wound up the circular drive, Sarah pressed her face to the window, hardly believing that this place was connected to her family. This was your mother's home, James said softly from the seat beside her. She used to ride horses through those fields every morning before school. Sarah could see horses grazing in the distance, their coats gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. She never mentioned horses. She never mentioned any of this. Elizabeth was very gifted with animals. She won several equestrian competitions in college. Eighth term, James pointed to a smaller building visible through the trees. That's the stable where she kept her horse. Midnight. We retired him to pasture after she left, and he lived to be 32. We buried him under that oak tree there. The car came to a stop in front of the mansion's main entrance, where two people were waiting on the steps. Sarah recognized them from the family photographs James had shown her, her cousins David and Margaret. Sarah. David Wellington strode forward as she got out of the car, his warm smile immediately putting her at ease. In his early 40s, with sandy brown hair and laugh lines around his eyes, he looked like he could be a movie star if he weren't running Wellington Holdings' West Coast operations. Elizabeth used to talk about having daughters someday, David said, pulling Sarah into a gentle hug that accommodated her pregnant belly. She would have been so proud of you. Margaret Wellington was more reserved but equally welcoming. Tall and elegant with silver-streaked dark hair, she had the kind of presence that commanded respect in boardrooms around the world. "We've prepared your mother's old room for you," Margaret said, her voice crisp but kind. "I hope you'll be comfortable there while we sort out this situation with your husband." As they walked through the mansion's front hallway, Sarah felt overwhelmed by the grandeur surrounding her. Crystal chandeliers hung from painted ceilings, priceless artwork lined the walls, and Persian rugs covered floors that looked like they'd been polished to perfection. "It's a lot to take in," James said, noticing her expression. "Your mother felt the same way when she first came home from college. She used to say the house felt like a museum until she filled it with laughter." They climbed a sweeping staircase to the second floor, where James opened the door to a sunlit bedroom suite that took Sarah's breath away. The room was decorated in soft blues and yellows, with French doors leading to a private balcony that overlooked the gardens. "This was Elizabeth's room from the time she was 12 until she left for college," Margaret explained. "We've kept it exactly as she left it." Sarah walked slowly around the room, taking in the details that revealed so much about the mother she'd never really known. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes on mathematics, computer science, literature, and art. A baby grand piano sat in the corner near the windows, sheet music still open to a Chopin nocturne. "She played beautifully," David said, following Sarah's gaze. "She used to give concerts for the family every Christmas Eve." On the vanity table sat a collection of family photographs. Sarah had never seen images of her mother laughing with friends, accepting academic awards, riding horses, and playing with young cousins who were now the adults welcoming Sarah home. "I need to show you something," James said, opening a door that led to an adjoining office space. "This is where your mother did her computer programming work." The office was equipped with state-of-the-art technology that looked decades ahead of anything Sarah had ever seen. Multiple monitors, advanced processors, and equipment she couldn't even identify filled the space. Elizabeth designed trading algorithms that are still generating income for the family foundation, Margaret explained. Her work in artificial intelligence was revolutionary for its time. She was developing predictive models for financial markets that were 20 years ahead of the industry standard, David added. If she'd lived, she would have changed the entire landscape of computational finance. Sarah sank into the chair at her mother's desk, running her fingers over the keyboard of a computer that represented a level of sophistication she'd never imagined her mother possessing. "Why didn't she ever tell me about any of this?" Sarah asked. "Maybe she was planning to," James suggested gently. "Maybe she thought she had more time." A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Margaret's assistant appeared with a concerned expression. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been a development. Richard Mitchell just tried to access Sarah's main trust account. When he was denied access, he became agitated and made threats against bank personnel." James's expression darkened. "What kind of threats?" "He told the teller that if the Wellington family thought they could steal his wife and child, they were going to regret it. He said he had resources they didn't know about and ways of getting what belonged to him." Sarah felt her baby kick anxiously, responding to her increased stress. "He's not going to give up, is he?" "No," James said grimly. "Men like Richard don't give up when they're cornered. They escalate. Margaret moved to the window, her expression thoughtful. We need to be prepared for the possibility that he'll try something desperate. What do you mean? Sarah asked. I mean that Richard Mitchell has already lost 2 wives under suspicious circumstances, David said. He's facing financial ruin and criminal prosecution. Desperate men do desperate things. As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah's phone began ringing. Richard's name appeared on the caller ID, and everyone in the room fell silent. Don't answer it, James advised. Actually, I think I should, Sarah said, surprising everyone. I want to hear what he has to say. She answered the call and put it on speaker so the others could hear. Sarah, sweetheart, I've been worried sick about you. Richard's voice was smooth and concerned, the tone he used when he was trying to manipulate her. Where are you? I'm somewhere safe, Richard. Safe, Sarah. You're 7 months pregnant. You need to be home where I can take care of you. The way you took care of Margaret Thornton and Patricia Carlisle. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. When Richard spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of warmth. I see they've been filling your head with lies. Are they lies, Richard? Did Margaret Thornton really commit suicide after you drained her trust fund? Did Patricia Carlisle really disappear after she tried to leave you? Sarah, you're being manipulated by people who want to use you for your money. Can't you see that the only person who's been using me for money is you? Everything I've done has been to protect our family. By stealing $5 million from my inheritance, by forging my signature on legal documents, by threatening to take my baby away from me. Richard's mask finally slipped completely. That baby is mine too, Sarah, and I will get what's mine. All of it. The only thing you're going to get is a prison sentence. We'll see about that. Richard's voice dropped to a whisper that made everyone in the room tense with alarm. You think your fancy rich family can protect you? You think they can keep me away from my child? You have no idea what I'm capable of. The line went dead. James immediately called his security team while Margaret contacted the family's attorneys. David stood by the window, watching the grounds with the vigilance of someone expecting trouble. He's going to try something tonight, David said grimly. I can feel it. Sarah placed her hands over her pregnant belly, feeling her daughter kick strongly as if she too sensed the danger surrounding them. What do we do? Sarah asked. We protect you and the baby, James said firmly. Whatever it takes. As the sun set over the Wellington estate, Sarah realized that her new life of wealth and family came with dangers she'd never imagined. But for the first time in 8 years, she wasn't facing those dangers alone, and that made all the difference. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the estate's security alarms began to wail. Sarah jolted awake in her mother's old bedroom, her hand instinctively going to her pregnant belly as she tried to orient herself. Through the French doors leading to the balcony, she could see flashlight beams moving across the darkened gardens. Her phone rang immediately. It was James. Sarah, stay in your room and away from the windows. We have multiple intruders on the property. Is it Richard? Almost certainly. Our security team is responding, but I want you to move into your mother's old safe room. Do you see the bookshelf to the left of the piano? Sarah looked across the moonlit room. Yes. Pull on the volume of Shakespeare's sonnets. Third shelf from the top, blue leather binding. Sarah found the book and pulled. To her amazement, a section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a hidden room behind it. This was installed during the Cold War, James explained as Sarah stepped into the concealed space. Your mother used to hide in there when she was in trouble for something. There's a phone, water, and a direct line to the police. The safe room was larger than Sarah had expected, with comfortable seating, supplies, and monitors showing feeds from security cameras around the estate. On the screens, she could see figures in dark clothing moving toward the main house. I count at least 6 men, Sarah told James through the secure phone line. Richard came prepared, but so did we. On the monitors, Sarah watched as the estate security team surrounded the intruders. What followed was a tense standoff that lasted nearly an hour, with Richard's men attempting to breach the mansion's security while the Wellington security team worked to contain them without triggering a violent confrontation. At 3:15, the estate's main lights came on, flooding the grounds with illumination that left the intruders nowhere to hide. Sarah could see Richard clearly now, standing near the front entrance with what appeared to be a weapon in his hand. Richard Mitchell. James's voice echoed across the grounds through a loudspeaker. You're trespassing on private property. Leave now and we'll consider not pressing charges. I want my wife, Richard shouted back. I want my child. You have no right to keep them from me. Your wife is here voluntarily, and she's asked you to stay away. She's been brainwashed. She doesn't know what she's doing. Sarah pressed the button to activate the external speaker system from the safe room. Her voice carried across the grounds with surprising strength. Richard, I know exactly what I'm doing. I know about the money you've been stealing. I know about Margaret and Patricia. I know what you are. Sarah. Richard's voice cracked with desperation. You're making a terrible mistake. These people don't care about you. They just want to control you. The only person who's been controlling me is you. I'm your husband. I love you. You don't love me. Richard, you love what you thought you could take from me. The standoff continued for another 20 minutes, with Richard alternately pleading and threatening while the security team maintained their positions. Sarah watched on the monitors as police cars began arriving, their red and blue lights strobing across the estate grounds. Detective Rodriguez approached with a megaphone. Richard Mitchell, you're under arrest for trespassing, domestic violence, financial fraud, and conspiracy. Surrender your weapon and come forward with your hands visible. This is all a misunderstanding, Richard shouted. They're holding my pregnant wife against her will. Sir, we've spoken with your wife. She's here voluntarily and has requested police protection from you. What happened next made Sarah's blood run cold. Instead of surrendering, Richard raised his weapon not toward the police, but toward the mansion windows where he thought Sarah might be hiding. If I can't have her, no one can, he screamed. The police response was immediate and decisive. Within seconds, Richard was on the ground, his weapon kicked away, his hands zip-tied behind his back. His companions surrendered without further resistance. As the police cars drove away with Richard and his associates, Sarah emerged from the safe room to find James, David, and Margaret waiting for her in the hallway. Is it over? She asked. The immediate danger is over, James said. But Richard will probably face federal charges for the financial crimes and attempted assault charges for tonight. He won't be getting out of prison for a very long time. Sarah sank into one of the hallway chairs, suddenly exhausted. I can't believe I was married to someone capable of this. Predators are very good at hiding their true nature, Margaret said gently. It's not your fault that you couldn't see what he was hiding. What happens now? Sarah asked. Now you focus on having a healthy baby, David said with a smile. And we focus on teaching you everything you need to know about being a Wellington. 3 months later, Sarah gave birth to a beautiful daughter in the estate's private medical facility. As she held baby Elizabeth, named for her grandmother, Sarah marveled at how much her life had changed. She has your mother's eyes, James said softly, gazing down at his great niece. And her grandmother's stubborn streak, I suspect, Margaret added with a laugh. Sarah looked around the room at the family she'd never known she had: James, David, Margaret, and several other cousins who'd come to welcome the newest Wellington into the world. For the first time in her life, she felt truly safe and truly loved. What do you think, Elizabeth? Sarah whispered to her daughter. Ready to learn about your family's empire? Baby Elizabeth yawned and settled more comfortably in her mother's arms, as if to say she was ready for whatever adventures lay ahead, and Sarah knew that together they could handle anything. 6 weeks after Elizabeth's birth, Sarah stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Wellington Foundation's Manhattan headquarters, her daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. The city sprawled below them, a testament to human ambition and achievement that her family had helped shape for 4 generations. This building was purchased by your great-grandfather in 1943, James explained, joining Sarah at the window. At the time, people thought he was crazy to invest so heavily in Manhattan real estate. What made him do it? Sarah asked, gently rocking Elizabeth as she stirred. Vision, the ability to see what others couldn't. James gestured toward the bustling streets below. Wellington Holdings now owns 47 buildings in Manhattan alone, plus significant holdings in London, Tokyo, and Dubai. Margaret approached with a tablet containing financial reports that would have overwhelmed Sarah just months ago. Now, after weeks of intensive education about her family's business empire, she was beginning to understand the scope of what she'd inherited. Your personal trust fund generates approximately $50 million per year in passive income, Margaret explained. But that's just the beginning. The family foundation controls assets worth over $400 billion. $400 billion, Sarah repeated, still struggling to comprehend numbers of that magnitude. Your mother's algorithms alone have generated over $60 billion in returns since her death, David added, entering the office with a stack of proposals. We've been using those profits to fund clean water projects in developing countries, scholarship programs for underprivileged students, and medical research. Sarah walked to her mother's portrait, which hung prominently in the foundation's main conference room. Elizabeth Wellington Mitchell smiled back at her daughter with the same warm eyes that baby Elizabeth had inherited. She would have revolutionized the entire tech industry if she'd lived, Sarah said softly. She still did, James replied. Through her work, through you, through your daughter. Legacy isn't just about what we accomplish in our lifetimes. It's about what we make possible for the people who come after us. Over the following weeks, Sarah immersed herself in learning every aspect of the Wellington Empire. She studied financial reports, attended board meetings, and met with the foundation's program directors to understand how their wealth was being used to improve lives around the world. We're not just rich people spending money, Margaret explained during one of their afternoon education sessions. We're stewards of resources that can change the world. Every investment decision, every charitable donation, every business partnership has the potential to impact millions of lives. Sarah learned that Wellington Holdings had been early investors in renewable energy companies that were now leading the fight against climate change. They funded education programs that had graduated over 200,000 students from poverty into professional careers. Their medical research grants had contributed to treatments for cancer, Alzheimer's disease, and rare genetic disorders. This is what your mother wanted to be part of, James told Sarah one evening as they reviewed proposals for new foundation initiatives. She believed that wealth without purpose was meaningless. What about my daughter? Sarah asked, looking down at Elizabeth, who was playing contentedly with a teething ring. What kind of life will she have growing up with all this? That depends on how you raise her, David said thoughtfully. Money can be a blessing or a curse. It can give someone the freedom to make a difference in the world, or it can insulate them from the real world entirely. How do I make sure it's a blessing? By teaching her that privilege comes with responsibility, Margaret said. By showing her that her advantages aren't just for her own benefit, but for the benefit of everyone she has the power to help. As the months passed, Sarah began to find her place within the family business. Her mathematical background, combined with what she was learning about her mother's work, made her particularly valuable in the foundation's technology investment arm. You have your mother's instincts for recognizing breakthrough innovations, James observed after Sarah had successfully identified a startup that would later become a billion-dollar company. It's like you inherited her algorithm for spotting the future. 1 year after discovering her true heritage, Sarah was asked to address the foundation's annual board meeting. As she stood before the assembled directors, titans of industry, Nobel Prize winners, and social change leaders, she felt the weight of her family's legacy and her own responsibility to carry it forward. A year ago, I thought I was nobody special, Sarah began. I was a pregnant woman married to a man who saw me only as a means to an end. I had no idea that I came from a family dedicated to using their resources to lift others up. She looked around the room at faces that had become familiar over the past months, people who had welcomed her, not just as an heiress, but as a partner in their mission to improve the world. Today, I want to propose something new. The Elizabeth Wellington Initiative for Women's Financial Independence. Sarah clicked to her first presentation slide, which showed statistics about domestic financial abuse that made several board members gasp. Every year, hundreds of thousands of women find themselves trapped in abusive relationships because they lack the financial resources to leave safely. They stay with partners who hurt them, steal from them, and control them because they believe they have no other choice. The room was completely silent as Sarah continued. We're going to change that. I'm proposing that we allocate $100 million annually to provide free legal services, emergency housing, financial education, and startup capital for women leaving abusive relationships. Board member Dr. Patricia Chen raised her hand. What makes you think we can succeed where other organizations have failed? Because we have something other organizations don't have, Sarah replied. We have the resources to provide comprehensive, long-term support. Most domestic violence programs can offer temporary shelter and basic counseling. We can offer that plus job training, educational opportunities, legal representation, and seed money for small businesses. We can create a pipeline that takes women from crisis to independence to empowerment, Sarah continued, and then we can teach them to help other women do the same thing. The board voted unanimously to approve the initiative. 6 months later, the Elizabeth Wellington Initiative had helped over 3,000 women escape abusive relationships and begin new lives. The program provided everything from immediate emergency services to long-term career development, with a success rate that exceeded even Sarah's optimistic projections. Your mother would be so proud, James told Sarah as they reviewed the program's first annual report. She always believed that the greatest privilege of wealth was the ability to open doors for others. Sarah looked down at baby Elizabeth, now a year old and already showing signs of her grandmother's intelligence and determination. As she watched her daughter play with blocks, building structures, and then knocking them down only to build them again, Sarah saw endless possibilities for the future. You know what I think, Elizabeth? Sarah said to her daughter, I think your great-grandmother would have been amazing at this job, and I think you're going to be even better at it someday. Elizabeth looked up at her mother and clapped her hands, as if to say she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Outside the foundation's windows, the sun was setting over Manhattan, casting the city in golden light. In that moment, Sarah felt the presence of all the Wellington women who had come before her and all the women who would come after. They were building something together, something that would last long after any of them were gone, something that would change the world. 2 years after Richard's arrest, Sarah thought the worst was behind her. The Elizabeth Wellington Initiative was thriving. Her daughter was healthy and happy, and she'd found her place within the family foundation, but legal battles with narcissistic abusers rarely end cleanly, and Richard Mitchell was nothing if not persistent. Sarah, we need to talk. James's voice was grim as he entered her office at the foundation's Manhattan headquarters. Richard's lawyers have filed an appeal. Sarah looked up from the financial reports she'd been reviewing, her heart immediately beginning to race. What kind of appeal? They're claiming his conviction was based on falsified evidence. They're requesting a new trial and asking for emergency custody pending the outcome. Emergency custody? Sarah's voice rose sharply enough that 2-year-old Elizabeth looked up from her coloring book with concern. He's in prison? Not anymore. James's expression was darker than Sarah had ever seen it. He was released on bail pending the appeal. The judge ruled that he wasn't a flight risk because of his business ties to the community. Sarah felt the familiar ice-cold fear that she'd thought she'd left behind. When? 3 days ago. 3 days. Why didn't anyone tell me? We've been working around the clock to strengthen our legal position before informing you. Sarah, there's more. Richard's lawyers are claiming that your testimony was coerced and that the Wellington family unduly influenced the original investigation. Margaret entered the office with their lead attorney, Jonathan Blake, who had been representing the family for over 2 decades. His expression was serious but confident. Mrs. Mitchell, Jonathan said, I want you to know that Richard's legal team is grasping at straws. The evidence against him is overwhelming, and these new claims are desperate attempts to create reasonable doubt. But what if it works? Sarah asked. What if they convince a jury that I was manipulated into testifying against him? That's not going to happen, Margaret said firmly. We have documentation going back years, financial records that can't be falsified, and testimony from his previous victims' families. What about Elizabeth? Can he really get custody? Jonathan shook his head. Temporary custody orders require proof that a child is in immediate danger with their current guardian. You're an exemplary mother with unlimited resources to provide for Elizabeth's well-being. No judge would remove her from your care based on these frivolous claims. Despite their reassurances, Sarah spent the next week in a state of constant anxiety. She increased security at the estate, limited her public appearances, and found herself checking and double-checking the locks on doors that hadn't been locked in months. Elizabeth sensed her mother's distress and became clingy, refusing to play independently and waking up crying from nightmares. Mama scared? Elizabeth asked one morning, her vocabulary still limited, but her emotional intelligence already remarkable. "Mama's just being extra careful, sweetheart," Sarah replied, pulling her daughter into her lap. "But we're safe. We have lots of people who love us and protect us." The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while Sarah was in a foundation board meeting. Margaret answered her phone, listened for a moment, then went pale. "That was courthouse security," Margaret announced to the room. "Richard Mitchell just filed an emergency motion for immediate custody of Elizabeth. He's claiming Sarah is mentally unstable due to sudden wealth acquisition and that the child is being raised in an environment detrimental to her development." Sarah's hands began to shake. "Can he do that?" "He can file anything he wants," Jonathan said, already gathering his papers. "But succeeding is a different matter entirely. We need to get to the courthouse immediately." The emergency hearing was held that same afternoon. Sarah sat in the courtroom holding Elizabeth, who had insisted on bringing her favorite stuffed elephant to what she thought was just another boring grown-up meeting. Richard's lawyer, a sharp-featured woman named Victoria Steinberg, presented their case with the kind of polished aggression that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Your Honor, my client contends that Sarah Mitchell has become mentally unstable since discovering her inheritance. She's gone from a modest, middle-class lifestyle to believing she's entitled to billions of dollars. This delusion has led her to make false accusations against a successful businessman who has never been anything but a devoted husband and father." "Objection." Jonathan Blake stood. "Mrs. Mitchell's inheritance has been thoroughly documented and verified. She's not delusional. She's legitimately one of the wealthiest women in America." Judge Harrison, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, looked skeptical. "Ms. Steinberg, are you seriously arguing that discovering you're an heiress constitutes mental illness?" "Your Honor, I'm arguing that the sudden lifestyle change, combined with the influence of family members who have their own financial interests at stake, has compromised Mrs. Mitchell's judgment and ability to make decisions in her child's best interest." Sarah felt her anger building. The same manipulation tactics Richard had used during their marriage were now being deployed in a courtroom to try to steal her daughter. "Furthermore," Steinberg continued, "Mr. Mitchell has reason to believe that his wife is being isolated from friends and outside perspectives, surrounded only by people who benefit from maintaining her dependence on the Wellington family fortune." "Your Honor," Jonathan Blake responded, "if we're talking about isolation and dependence, let's examine Mr. Mitchell's behavior during his marriage. He systematically cut Mrs. Mitchell off from friends, controlled her access to money, and made her believe she was financially dependent on him while secretly stealing millions from her trust fund." Judge Harrison turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'd like to hear from you directly. How do you respond to these allegations about your mental state and your fitness as a mother?" Sarah stood, Elizabeth balanced on her hip, and faced the judge who would decide their fate. "Your Honor, 2 years ago, I was living a lie. I was married to a man who convinced me I was worthless, powerless, and completely dependent on him. I discovered that I have a family who loves me, resources to provide for my daughter's future, and the ability to help other women escape the same kind of abuse I endured." She looked directly at Richard, who was sitting at the defendant's table with an expression of fake concern that she now recognized as calculated manipulation. "If that makes me mentally unstable, then I'll gladly be crazy for the rest of my life, because the alternative is going back to being the scared, isolated woman who lets someone else define her worth." Judge Harrison studied Sarah for a long moment. "Mrs. Mitchell, can you tell me about your current living situation and support system?" "I live at the Wellington family estate with my Uncle James, my cousins David and Margaret, and a staff of people who help care for Elizabeth when I'm working. She has her own pediatrician, educational specialists, and more loving family members than any child could ask for." "And your work with the foundation?" "I run a program that has helped over 10,000 women escape abusive relationships and rebuild their lives. It's work that gives my life meaning and provides Elizabeth with a legacy she can be proud of." Elizabeth chose that moment to announce loudly, "Mama help people." The courtroom erupted in quiet laughter, and even Judge Harrison smiled. "Ms. Steinberg," the judge said, turning back to Richard's lawyer, "what evidence do you have that Mr. Mitchell would provide a better environment for this child than what Mrs. Mitchell has described?" "Your Honor, Mr. Mitchell is a successful CEO with a stable income, and a stable income derived from stealing from his wife's trust fund? Alleged stealing. Your Honor, those charges are currently under appeal. The financial records aren't under appeal. Ms. Steinberg, the evidence is quite clear that Mr. Mitchell diverted millions of dollars from accounts belonging to his wife without her knowledge or consent. Judge Harrison looked at her notes for several minutes while the courtroom waited in tense silence. Elizabeth played quietly with her stuffed elephant, occasionally babbling to herself about mama work and Uncle James. Finally, the judge spoke. Motion for emergency custody is denied. Mr. Mitchell, the evidence presented suggests that you're not seeking custody in your daughter's best interest, but rather as a means of maintaining control over your ex-wife and her financial resources. Richard half rose from his chair. Your Honor, that's not. Sit down, Mr. Mitchell. Furthermore, I'm ordering that you maintain a distance of at least 500 feet from Mrs. Mitchell and the child at all times. Any violation of this order will result in immediate imprisonment. As they left the courthouse, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. Richard's desperate legal maneuvers had failed, and she was finally, truly free. Mama happy? Elizabeth asked as they walked to their car. Yes, sweetheart. Mama's very happy. That evening, Sarah sat in her mother's old room at the estate, holding Elizabeth as she drifted off to sleep. Through the windows, she could see the lights of the Foundation's research facility, where teams of scientists were working on projects that would improve millions of lives. She thought about the scared pregnant woman who had been pushed in a bank lobby 3 years ago, and she smiled. That woman had found her family. That woman had found her strength. That woman had changed the world. And this was only the beginning. 5 years after the courthouse victory that secured Elizabeth's safety, Sarah stood before the Wellington Foundation's board of directors once again. But this time, she wasn't just presenting a new initiative, she was being voted in as the Foundation's youngest ever chairwoman. Ladies and gentlemen, James announced to the packed boardroom, I'm proud to present our new chairman, Sarah Wellington Mitchell. The applause was thunderous. Elizabeth, now 7 years old and sitting in the front row with her Uncle James, clapped enthusiastically and called out, That's my mama. More laughter filled the room, the kind of warm, genuine joy that made Sarah's heart swell with gratitude for the family she'd found and the life she'd built. Thank you, Sarah said, her voice strong and confident in a way that would have amazed the frightened woman she'd once been. 5 years ago, I thought I knew who I was. I was wrong about almost everything. She clicked to her first presentation slide, which showed a photograph of the original Elizabeth Wellington Initiative office, a single room with 2 desks and a telephone. Today, the Elizabeth Wellington Initiative operates in 47 states and 12 countries. We've helped over 50,000 women escape abusive relationships and rebuild their lives. But that's just the beginning of what we can accomplish together. Sarah looked around the room at the faces that had become family board members who had welcomed her not just as an heiress, but as a partner in their mission to change the world. I want to tell you about my vision for the next phase of our work, the Elizabeth Wellington Global Education Initiative. She clicked to the next slide, which showed statistics about women's education worldwide that made several board members lean forward with interest. Right now, over 130 million girls around the world are denied access to education simply because they're female. They're kept out of school by poverty, by cultural barriers, by families who don't see the value in educating daughters. Elizabeth Wellington, sitting in the front row, raised her small hand. Mama, can I ask a question? Sarah smiled at her daughter's curiosity. Of course, sweetheart. Why don't people want girls to learn? That's exactly the right question. Elizabeth, and it's exactly why we need to change things. Sarah turned back to the board. We have the resources to fund comprehensive education programs that don't just put girls in classrooms. We can address the underlying issues that keep them out. Poverty relief for their families, community education about the value of girls' education, and economic opportunities for women that demonstrate the power of education. Board member Dr. Patricia Chen nodded approvingly. What kind of numbers are we talking about? $5 billion over 10 years. Enough to fund complete educational programs for over 2 million girls worldwide. The room buzzed with excitement. Even by Wellington Foundation standards, it was an ambitious proposal. But here's what makes this different from other educational initiatives, Sarah continued. Every girl we educate becomes an advocate for the next generation. We're not just funding schools, we're creating a network of educated women who will fight for their daughters, their communities, and their countries. Margaret Wellington raised her hand. Sarah, this is exactly the kind of transformational thinking your mother would have brought to this work. How do we measure success? We measure it in generations, Sarah replied. When a girl goes to school, her future children are 6 times more likely to be educated. When women have economic opportunities, domestic violence rates drop dramatically. When mothers are educated, infant mortality rates plummet. We're not just changing individual lives, we're changing the trajectory of entire societies. The board voted unanimously to approve the initiative. After the meeting, Sarah walked through the foundation's halls with Elizabeth, who insisted on stopping to examine every photograph and award on the walls. Mama, is great-grandma Elizabeth in these pictures? Elizabeth asked, pointing to a series of family portraits. Some of them, Sarah said, kneeling down to her daughter's level. Would you like to see my favorite one? They walked to the portrait that hung in the main hallway, Elizabeth Wellington Mitchell at her college graduation, her smile radiant with possibility and promise. She looks like you, Mama. People say you look like her too. Will I help people like you and great-grandma Elizabeth? Sarah pulled her daughter into a hug, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and marveling at how much joy this little person brought to her life. Only if you want to, sweetheart. You can be anything you want to be. I want to help people, like you do. Then you will. But first, you have to learn everything you can. You have to be curious about the world and kind to everyone you meet. Can you do that? Yes, Mama. As they walked toward the exit, they passed the Foundation's research laboratories, where teams of scientists were working on projects that would touch millions of lives. They passed the Education Center, where scholarship recipients were preparing for careers that would lift their families out of poverty. They passed the Crisis Intervention Center, where trained counselors were helping women escape dangerous situations and build new lives. This is all possible because of your great-grandmother, Sarah told Elizabeth as they rode the elevator to the parking garage. She believed that wealth without purpose was meaningless. She believed that privilege came with responsibility. What's responsibility, Mama? It means that when you have the power to help people, you have to use it, not because you have to, but because it's the right thing to do. That evening, Sarah tucked Elizabeth into bed in the same room where her mother had slept as a child. The space had been redecorated with cheerful colors and child-sized furniture, but the essence remained the same, a place where a brilliant woman had dreamed of changing the world. Mama, tell me the story about the scared lady at the bank, Elizabeth requested, as she did most nights. It had become their bedtime ritual, the story of how Sarah had discovered her family and found her strength. Elizabeth never tired of hearing about the day her mama stopped being scared and started being brave. Once upon a time, Sarah began, settling into the rocking chair beside Elizabeth's bed. There was a woman who thought she was nobody special. She was married to a man who told her she was powerless and worthless, and she believed him. But she wasn't powerless, Elizabeth interjected, as she always did. No, she wasn't. She just didn't know it yet. One day, this woman went to a bank to ask some questions about money, and her husband got very angry. He pushed her. He did. But a kind man at the bank saw what happened, and he recognized something about the woman. He recognized that she belonged to a family that had been looking for her for a very long time. A family with lots of money. A family with lots of love, Sarah corrected gently. The money was just a tool they used to help people. The real treasure was the family itself. And then what happened? Then the woman learned that she wasn't powerless at all. She learned that she came from a long line of strong women who used their resources to make the world better. She learned that she could help other women who were scared, just like she had been. And she had a beautiful baby girl. She did. And that baby girl grew up knowing that she was loved, that she was strong, and that she could do anything she set her mind to. Elizabeth yawned and snuggled deeper into her blankets. Mama, when I grow up, I want to help scared ladies too. I think you will, sweetheart. I think you'll help lots of people. As Elizabeth drifted off to sleep, Sarah sat in the rocking chair for a few more minutes, looking around the room where her mother had once dreamed her own dreams of the future. On the nightstand sat a photograph of 4 generations of Wellington women: her great-grandmother, her grandmother, her mother, herself, and Elizabeth. Strong women who had built something lasting. Women who had used their advantages to create opportunities for others. Women who understood that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touched and the changes you made possible. Outside the window, the estate grounds stretched into darkness, but Sarah could see the lights of the foundation's buildings in the distance. Tomorrow, those buildings would be full of people working to solve problems, fund solutions, and create opportunities. Teachers would be training for classrooms in rural villages. Researchers would be developing new technologies to provide clean water. Counselors would be preparing to help women escape dangerous situations. All of it funded by a family that understood the weight of privilege and the joy of purpose. Sarah thought about Richard, who was now serving a 15-year sentence for financial fraud and domestic violence. She rarely thought about him anymore, except to feel grateful that his narcissistic abuse had ultimately led her to discover her true family and her real purpose. She thought about the scared pregnant woman who had been pushed in a bank lobby 7 years ago, and she smiled. That woman had found her family. That woman had found her strength. That woman had changed the world. Standing up from the rocking chair, Sarah kissed her sleeping daughter's forehead and whispered, "Sweet dreams, Elizabeth. Tomorrow we'll keep changing the world." As she turned off the lights and closed the door, Sarah felt the presence of all the Wellington women who had come before her and the promise of the ones who would come after. They were building something together, something that would last long after any of them were gone. Something that would change the world, one life at a time, for generations to come. Outside, the stars shone down on the Wellington estate, bearing witness to a legacy of love, strength, and service that would continue as long as there were people who needed help and women brave enough to provide it. The Elizabeth Wellington Initiative had grown from one scared woman's determination to help others into a global force for change. And this was only the beginning. In boardrooms and classrooms around the world, women were discovering their own strength, their own worth, and their own power to transform not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others. The scared woman at the bank had become the leader of a movement. The powerless victim had become an agent of change. The isolated wife had become the matriarch of a family dedicated to lifting others up. And in a small bedroom in the Hudson Valley, a 7-year-old girl slept peacefully, dreaming of the day when she would carry the torch forward and continue building the world her great-grandmother had envisioned, a world where every woman knew her worth, claimed her power, and used her strength to help others do the same. The foundation they had built together would endure. The lives they had changed would create ripple effects that would touch millions more. And the legacy of love, courage, and purpose would continue for as long as there were people willing to believe that wealth without compassion was meaningless. But wealth combined with love could truly change everything. This was the Wellington way. This was the power of women supporting women. This was what happened when someone finally understood that their greatest strength lay not in what they could gain for themselves, but in what they could give to others. And it all started with one push, one moment of cruelty that revealed a truth too powerful to hide. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for the best thing you'll ever do. Sarah Elizabeth Wellington. Mitchell had found her family, claimed her inheritance, and built a legacy that would outlast them all. But most importantly, she had learned to help others find their own strength, their own worth, and their own power to change the world. And that was a treasure worth more than all the money in the world.